This episode is sponsored by Turn Gymnastics Apparel, the brand dedicated solely to the sport of men's gymnastics. Choose Turn this season to outfit your team with industry-leading design concepts and elevated options for elite performance. Get the design process started today. Visit turn-gymnastics.com to discover the latest possibilities. Turn. Never done perfecting. Thank you, Turn, for supporting the Sam Oldham podcast. Supporting Turn helps us bring you new content every single week from the world of gymnastics. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Sam Oldham podcast. In today's episode of the Sam Oldham podcast, I'm joined by Heath Thorpe, the 2023 Australian National All-Around Champion in gymnastics. He has a large online following within the gymnastics community, thanks to his incredibly unique gymnastics style and his ability to communicate online through social media platforms. And this is his story. Heath, thanks for joining us, mate. I'm really excited for this episode. I think first and foremost, I'm a massive fan of your gymnastics. I think your style of gymnastics is incredibly unique. And I want to start off, before we go back to your story, we were talking a bit before we went live. I don't really know too much about your story, how you got into the sport, your career as a junior gymnast, and how that then transitioned into senior gymnastics. Just tell me, what was your experience of this summer? The Olympic Games, Paris 2024, obviously you weren't there competing. How did you find that experience this summer of not being there, watching it? I'm sure you wanted to be there. What was it like for you?
It was a little bit different than I anticipated. I think the reality of missing out on Olympic Games for me was less painful than the thought of it. Okay. I kind of anticipated the fear of missing out and the fear of failure and coming short, and that really stressed me out in the lead up to it. Oceania Championships was my only shot at qualifying, and Jesse Moore ended up getting the spot as he deserved. But I think I started PB that day, so I think the idea that I did my best and it still wasn't enough was a lot easier than if I was thinking if I could have done this differently and so on. But once I kind of got over the initial disappointment, which only took a few days, I kind of was just able to reflect on the whole journey and understand that I did the best I could, and I was really proud of that. And that's something I didn't think I was going to be able to do so quickly following it. But I enjoyed watching the games. I'm like such a gym nerd. I ended up doing the broadcasting for the Australian provider for the gymnastics. So that was really cool. I basically, as much as it is my personality, I reached out straight away. I was at an event and said, I'm not going, so now can I do broadcasting? And they gave me the gig. So it was cool. I obviously was disappointed to not be there, but I was happy to watch my friends watch some quality gymnastics and enjoy some downtime too.
What was your experience of the broadcasting side of the sport, mate? I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. You know, I've seen a lot of former athletes try and give it a go. And as soon as you're in that situation, I think most of us are kind of armchair fans sat back at home saying, God, why don't they know what they're talking about? They're making so many mistakes and they're getting skills wrong and all of this. But actually, the reality is, I imagine when the gymnast puts their hand up to do that routine and you're told, okay, Heath, it's your turn to do the commentary for this routine, it must be quite daunting and nerve-wracking.
Yeah, it was a very different experience. I'm quite used to media now, but I've never done live media, and especially for an event so big. I didn't do the exact commentary of the competition. I was basically the expert that would give a preview for the competition and summarize afterwards. And that was for MAG, WAG, and even previewing trampoline and rhythmic as well. So it was a lot to remember. And they chucked me on live the first day, and not a whole lot of briefing because I think they assumed, based on my confidence of asking for the role, that I had done it before. So I felt a little bit like a deer in headlights, but I kind of just settled it into myself and knew I knew a lot about gymnastics, and I did a lot of my research. But the hardest thing was name pronunciations and trying to get them right, whilst remembering the data and then also the competition results. And you're told to wrap everything up in 8 to 10 minutes. And it was a task, but I got good feedback and they were really happy. So I can't complain.
That's amazing, mate. And did you approach it in terms of, did you really go in depth with the research? I know you said that you're a bit of a gym nerd, you know a lot about WAG and MAG, but I imagine, you know, I would be quite daunted about maybe doing some work for trampoline and potentially, did you say you did rhythmic as well?
Yeah, a little bit. It was more just I was on for the artistic week and then I had to give a little bit of an insight. So that was a bit more surface level in terms of just knowing the names and main contenders and, you know, trampoline is this many skills and so on. But you also had to make the artistic information palatable and digestible for a general audience, but then you still wanted to provide enough knowledge to provide that insight. So it was a bit of a difficult balance. And then also you had the stars like Simone Biles and Rebecca Andrade competing. So everyone wants to hear about that.
Yeah.
You also need to try and give some credit to other athletes at the same time. So it was a lot to balance, but I was happy with it overall. I can see myself doing something similar in the future.
Oh, amazing. After the games then, Heath, did you, when it finished and it concluded and all the gymnastics was done, did you have a feeling of, okay, now I'm super motivated to make sure that in 4 years' time, maybe that I can be there and actually compete? How did you feel? Because it's a strange time, right? It's almost a limbo. Yeah. It's a limbo period after the Olympic Games. Everything goes quiet. There's not a lot of competitions happening. The new code of points hasn't come into effect yet. So you're kind of training old skills, but learning new ones. You're not quite sure about the rules or even what your year is maybe going to look like. How has this time been for you, that limbo period between the games finishing and then almost getting through to Christmas and then the new year starting?
Yeah, so I deliberately told myself whether I'd qualified or not that I was going to take 2 or 3 months off after either Oceania or Paris.
Okay.
And I did exactly that. So that was a big thing for me. I'd never taken time off gymnastics, and I think it helped ground me and reflect on the reasons I do the sport and so on. And yes, it motivates me for the idea of LA, but I think also the experience of missing out on the games allowed me to understand that an Olympics is as important as you make it to be, which might sound weird to some people, but I think I noticed friends were watching and like non-gymnastics friends, and they would turn the TV on, watch it, turn it off and not think about it again. But then for us, it's our entire life that we work towards. So it gave me a different perspective of understanding that I didn't want to base my entire worth as an athlete off this one competition. So of course I want to aim for LA, but it made me even sit back further and realize that I wanted to take my gymnastics 6 months to a year at a time, and these digestible blocks instead that I felt were manageable and also more achievable. So I didn't have that big post disappointment potentially and not feeling good about myself as a person, athlete. And yeah, it's just helped me recalibrate how I see the sport.
That's really interesting, mate. I think that's a very mature way to go about that process, because it's very difficult for everybody. I think James Hall we had on recently, he said something similar. I guess the Olympic Games is what you make it. And for him, missing out this year, I'm sure would have been difficult, but the way he approached it was that, no, look, I've had an amazing career. These experiences have been incredible. And actually, even being the reserve, I want to do the best job that I can possibly do. I think it certainly helps that maybe you felt like you did the best job you could have done at the Oceania Championships. Let's go back to the start then, mate. What attracted you first to the sport of gymnastics? And was it a case of you being pulled towards it or pushed towards it? And I guess what I mean by that is that when I started gymnastics, it was a school teacher that pushed me towards it by telling my mum, you should take Sam along. What was your story?
Kind of a little bit of the opposite. The influence I did have within my family was my auntie. She was a level 10 gymnast back in the day, and I was a very active child. I was doing all sports. I grew up in a rural town, and gymnastics just wasn't accessible to us. The closest gym was, 40 minutes, an hour away. Her closest high performance center, an hour and a half away. So it was something I didn't come across often. But I was doing other sports, as I said, including dance as well, like a bit of hip hop, jazz, tap. So things, and karate. So we were kind of learning how to flip and dive roll. Right. So naturally, I just started getting really good at tumbling, forward rolls, round offs, just teaching myself on the backyard trampoline. And my auntie would start throwing me in the beach, like the back salts from the hands. So I could already do all these things. And she convinced my mum to let me try it. My mum was very much like, no, we're going to play ball sports, the rural sports around the town. It's easier. I don't want to drive that far, like blah, blah, blah. And then my best mate in primary school as well, he was a gymnast. So those two people basically said, all right, go have a trial class. And I think it was just basically from there, the coaches were like, you need to stay in the sport. Let's keep you here. And mum was supportive in the end, of course, even if it wasn't her original vision for me. But yeah, it was basically two influential people in my youth life, and then a natural inkling for the sport.
Tell me a little bit, Heath, about the culture of sport within Australia, because I grew up, and when I started gymnastics, it was in the year 2000 when Sydney happened, right? And I always remember like sport being a massive deal in Australia. That's what it always felt like to me growing up, right? Because in a lot of sports, so in England, let's say rugby, cricket in particular, but then you've got like swimming, sports that Australia are naturally very good at and historically do well in. It's a big thing for us to beat Australia. Like it's a real big, we have a big rivalry, right? And I just always felt that sport in Australia is a big, big thing. So culturally, how big is it over there? Just for people that are maybe in the UK listening, I know that the weather in Australia is so much better than it is in the UK. So maybe generally the younger generation will spend more time outside. Just tell us a bit of what it's like in Australia and the culture of sport, and maybe what it's like in schools, because we have a real problem over here in the UK at the moment. Kids aren't doing much sport at all. That's being taken away all the time. Sometimes there are schools that are maybe only doing 1 hour of sport a week. So the ability to do sport for young children and that opportunity and access is gradually being taken away all of the time. Because let's say you might be in a family that don't have a sporting background. Well, school might be the only place you ever get the chance to try sport. So what is it like in Australia, mate?
Yeah, I mean, I can only really speak to the rural experience of when I was growing up. But for that part, sport was entirely immersed in the town's culture and school culture. You know, you'd have PE class multiple times a week, and we'd have footy posts and soccer goals and running tracks out on the ovals. So at school lunch, you'd be running around playing tag, or there was like even skipping programs. We played netball, basketball. We had swimming carnivals. You had athletics carnivals every year. So it was hugely a thing for us as kids, and it was just expected that you did kind of 2 or 3 sports as a kid to improve the motor neuron skills and get outside. And yeah, I think the weather has a big part in it. I did grow up in a bit of a colder part of Australia, but it's still not even worth noting compared to the UK's weather. So we were outside a lot. You'd be at the beach. A big part of it as well is we all had to learn how to swim as kids. Like it's basically mandatory. You have swimming programs at school because, you know, our beaches are dangerous and there's a lot of water. So I think there's just like that activity was embedded in your childhood. I don't know what it's like as much these days as well. I live over here now and I don't have any younger siblings, so I don't see it as much. But yeah, it was a huge influence for us.
When you first got into the sport then, Heath, I'm trying to think now, obviously 2000 would have been way too early for you, but 2006, the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, did you start the sport on the back of that? Because that was a big deal as well. That was a big Commonwealth Games, and the Australian team at that time were very, very strong. So what was the kind of system within gymnastics at that time when you started that you came into? Now, you might not have been aware of it at the time because you were just starting out, but what kind of a system was in place? Because obviously in recent years, the Australian team has struggled more than they did around that time, 2006, I'm thinking 2002 Commonwealth Games. So what was the system you were coming into when you started the sport?
Yeah, I stepped into the sport in 2008. So I was born in 2000. I'm a 2000 baby. And as I said, it was a rural club. So you didn't get a lot of insight into high performance. But I was inspired by the Beijing Olympics, and that's kind of another part as to why I went into it. But I know we had our state high performance centers that the clubs would feed into if you were talent ID'd. And then there was the national squad program. There was the state squad program, kind of just like every section of the country had their own high performance program. And I believe at that time we had a centralized national program in terms of at the Australian Institute of Sport. That's where the guys trained, or at least there were a few centers set up. So it was a little bit more of a centralized program. And I think we did have more funding from what I can gather back then. And probably because coming off that 2006 Melbourne Commonwealth Games, I assume the government would have put sport funding into it. So yeah, it was more of a centralized program, and now it's shifted a little more to individualized high performance programs and centers and clubs. It's a bit chaotic, to be honest. So it's not as structured as it once was, in my opinion, at least.
So it is a different system now that you're part of than it was, let's say, 15 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we don't even have a national lead coach or a national team coach.
Really?
So, and we haven't the whole time I've been a senior international athlete. We basically have a coach that steps in for each competition as that role in those lead-ins, but we don't have a fixed national team coach. I'm just thinking, because that's really interesting. What are the positives of that, Heath? Are there positives? As I said, I don't really know any different on a senior level. I think on one hand, it allows a lot more autonomy for individual programs to work with our athletes because we don't have to follow an exact structure. But then at the same time, I think that can be used a bit as a scapegoat for poor mistakes potentially. It's like if there's not a good result as a country, then it's that's onto the coaches and the athletes themselves because there's no one to place accountability on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Would you expect that potentially might change in the future? I know that Australia are looking at hosting the games again, right?
Yeah, I think so. National league coaches, and we're very much in the discussion parts of what our league campaign looks like. But from what I understand, they want to push more for a team and so on. So that's good to hear, but we'll have to wait and see if it eventuates into criteria and policies.
Yeah, I guess for you as an athlete, you're in the here and now, right? Like the future would be great, but that's very wishful thinking. Okay, you got to focus on yourself. What about the roots of your style of gymnastics, Heath? Where did that come from? You know, I was a gymnast when I started out that was quite stylish, but that was almost forced into me because I had to do choreography every week and I hated it. But what that meant was that as I grew up, you know, people would begin to say, oh, wow, your style of gymnastics is really nice. You've got a great line. And I think that just naturally came from doing that work at the ballet bar every week. What about yours, Heath? Because you really do have a unique style. Was that there from the beginning? Did you come into the sport with that unique style, or was that developed over time?
Yeah, as I said, I think like as a kid, I did dance and stuff, and I had a lot more expression, and I was a lot more out there. I was also a little more feminine, I guess, as a kid, growing up gay, you know, and I watched women's gymnastics, and they were kind of like my influences as well. So naturally, I had a bit more of a flourish to my gymnastics. So it was there, but then at the same time within the sport, it was kind of pulled back a bit and it was told to look a certain way or do this. So it wasn't until lately, I'd say in the last few years, that it's really eventuated to kind of my trademark gymnastics. I had a few influences watching, like obviously Nemov was someone I watched growing up, and Hippolyta was a big one. And actually you as well. I used to watch your Com Games 2014 when I was stepping into junior. Yeah, I really loved your gymnastic style. And I remember I used to watch your training vlogs as well religiously. So I got to say you're definitely an influence into my gymnastics.
You, man. That's very kind.
And I told Sergey that as well. I saw him in Luxembourg earlier this year and I spoke to him about it. But yeah, there were a few gymnasts and WAG, and it was kind of just intersectional to a lot of influences. But yeah, it's definitely a unique style. And I think the more I've lent into it, the better it's made me as an athlete as well.
You just raised, I just thought of a question there, Heath. It's really interesting. When I started gymnastics, right? So the first group that I was in, it was just me and 15 girls. And I was quite insecure about that. And when I came into the sport of men's gymnastics, I think everybody around me carried that insecurity. So we were almost outwardly trying to look tough, be tough, because anybody at school that would ever say anything was like, gymnastics is a girl's sport and you have to do floor routines to music and wear leotards. So like what we would project to the world was, no, we're not like that. It's tough. You've got to be hard and all of this, right? And we carried that insecurity around with us. What were those challenges like for you, being somebody that, you know, didn't fit into that mold, and maybe some of the confusion and the mental battles you had around that time? Can you talk about that a little bit? Because it must have been very, very difficult.
Yeah, it was. I think hugely it was an issue for myself growing up when I was looking at being 12, 13 years old. I think the interesting thing as well as growing up gay is people realize it before you often do. Okay. So people telling you how you act or how you talk or walk or do certain things. And then you start internalizing that and trying to change it. Okay. So then when I was in the gym, I think that was supposed to kind of be my safe space and my outlet as well for that. But even further, as you said, there's like this overcompensation to make it a more macho environment to produce the masculine look of the sport. So it was at times even worse in the gym with older athletes and coaches. It was, you know, it wasn't the best experience at a young age, impressionable age. I think gay used to be thrown around as an insult a lot and, you know, don't be a girl, don't do this, don't do that. So the skills I wanted to naturally do or the flourish I wanted to do was perceived as a bad thing. I think that's why it didn't eventuate until recent years when I've finally been able to be comfortable with myself, that I'm confident to look however way I want. But it was absolutely a troublesome culture and environment for youth. I know I have a lot of mates that were in the sport that were gay, and I don't really know any of them that are still in it. And a lot of them left because of it, and they didn't come out until afterwards because they didn't feel comfortable to do it in the sport. So it's improved a lot, I find, at least for myself, or at least being someone who's very out and secure in myself. People at least don't say much to me these days. But when I was back as a kid, it was a pretty crappy thing to have to deal with.
Yeah, how would that translate into, you know, the conversations you would have or the things that people would actually say, Heath? Like, because I remember the head coach of our gym growing up, if you forgot every now and then someone would forget their training shorts, right? and he'd say, right, you're gonna have to take your trousers off, and you're gonna have to go on the beam in your pants in front of everybody. It's like an embarrassment, punishment type of thing. It was that kind of like locker room type culture of, it's just banter, but it wasn't. And you never wanted to be that kid that stood out. You know, you almost wanted to just fit in, which is really, really interesting. And I think a lot as kids, for me, people are scared of different. They don't like different. And a lot of it is, okay, right, if the heat is on that person, that's okay. I just don't want it to be on me. So I'm going to go along with it so that nobody's pointing at me, right? And I think a lot of that is what happens with kids and bullying to an extent and picking people out. Quite often, kids are mean, right? They'll pick the weakest link or the one person that's different and gang up. That must have been very, very hard at times, I imagine. Just knowing my own experience, I was so insecure as like a young person in sport. You know, I was tiny for my age, right? Like, I was so small compared to everybody else my own age. I was very insecure about that. I wasn't necessarily insecure about gymnastics because I knew how tough gymnasts were. So if anybody said anything, I was like, well, I just know you're not going to get yourself on a high bar and train for 6 hours a day and handle Sergey every day. You won't be able to like hack that. So that kind of brushed off my shoulder. But I think there was an insecurity there. How did you battle that as a teenager that's going through the normal things that teenagers are going through, trying to fit in, trying to figure out who you are, but on top of that, you're gay in a sport where that's almost rejected from the get-go. Yeah. How did you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I have to like commend my family as well, because they were always super supportive. And I speak about my mum often, but I remember when I came out to her, I was the first gay person she knew. So it's not like my family had a lot of experience with gay family members as such. But one thing she was willing to do was like learn and love me and appreciate me and grow with me. So I'm very grateful for that. And because of her, I've never had any issues within my family. So I at least knew I had that space to come back to at home and talk to about and explore that without feeling judged. So that was great. And then on the other hand as well, around 14, 15, I went to a school that was an art school and had gymnastics as a specialized program. So I think naturally in a school where there's more art, there's theater, there's ballet, there's a lot more openly gay kids than in gymnastics. So I also had that outlet outside of the gym as I got a little bit older. But in saying that, whilst also in the gym, there wasn't a whole lot of escape. I had my mates that were, I guess, closeted and secretly gay and growing up with and figuring it out with. But I do remember very, very specifically, there was one time when we were 13 or 14, and there was three of us, Ruben, Hudson, myself, and I think we were the top three gymnasts on floor at that time of our age in the country. And coincidentally, we were all gay, but I think we all just had really nice artistry and flair. So we were just doing our routines normally. And then one of the senior boys just decided to do like a showcase of our routine and kind of just make it exaggerated and as flamboyant and feminine as possible and get the whole gym around and this and this. And, you know, for them, it was that fun banter. It was whatever, haha. But I think, well, the fact that I can still remember obviously has an effect on me. But it was just, as you said, that humiliation and that kind of shame around femininity, whether you're gay or not, has an effect on you. But then also when you're struggling with your identity on top of that and trying to overcome that, then it's like an added barrier. So there were a lot of cases like that, and coaches would say comments and like they would throw around, you know, that's gay or a slur here and there in the gym as an insult when you did a bad skill. So just hearing these things and reinforcing that gay is a bad connotation and something to not be made it 10 times more difficult. But I think having that saving grace of my family in school and people away from it kind of allowed me to be who I was comfortably still. But also in saying that, like, one thing people don't realize as well is if you grow up gay and you're a gay man, you also have internalized homophobia because you've learned a lot of the things that society tells you to not be. So additionally, even once I was outwardly gay, I would still have issues with femininity or performing in a certain way or doing this because I didn't want to, again, lean into a stereotype. So it has these ongoing effects that you still have to deconstruct daily. And it's only been the last couple of years I've been like, oh, I'm okay with it now. But it's taken time, and the culture of machoism in gymnastics contributed to that.
How did that impact your gymnastics development, Heath?
Yeah, I mean, a high bar, for example, everyone kind of knows me for my high bar now because I'm doing defs and Jaeger fulls and, Jaeger gingers, triple backs. I wasn't allowed to do a Jaeger, and that was the first skill I wanted to do because I was told it was a women's skill. So I wanted to learn Jaeger and I wanted to learn Ginger. They were all I wanted. And I was allowed to play with them, but I couldn't really compete them. And, you didn't want your high bar looking gay. So it was either Kovacs or Tkachevs in our gym. And I had a huge mental block with Tkachevs. I managed to overcome it for a few years, but it was a daily battle. So my high bar didn't really come to what it is now until 2020, 2021, when I had a bit more autonomy over the skills I wanted to do, when I started playing with Markov and Ginga, and then we started twisting. But I honestly think if I was just allowed to lean into my natural style a bit more, I would have advanced early on high bar. And even Yurchenko, I wasn't allowed to do when I was younger because it was a girls' vault and it was a gay vault. So don't do that. So I tried to do Sukaharas up until I was 16, but sucked at them. And now I do Yurchenko 2.5. So I do wonder if there was, it prevented me from being a better athlete earlier on. But in saying that, I feel like everything kind of happens for a reason, and you learn based on mistakes and experiences. And that's kind of led me to where I am. But yeah, it's interesting that people have a correlation with a certain skill to femininity. And it's the same even with me doing leaps and stuff. Like, people are fine for a stag leap, but if you straighten your front leg, then that's gay, or that's a girl skill.
It's really interesting how that dictated the style, the type of gymnastics that you were training and performing. And now that you are, I think you said this yourself, able to completely fully express yourself, you're now actually like reaping the benefits of being able to do that. What's it like, Heath, being so far away from the rest of the world in a sport like gymnastics, being in Australia? And how does that impact your ability, I guess, to develop? We're in Europe and we have I don't know how many countries are in Europe. There are so many, right? And we can all compete against each other all the time from a very young age. And you'll know as well as me that the more often you can be around high-level performance, the better, because you're going to learn, okay, what I need to do, what does this level feel like? Because there are different levels to everything, right? As a junior, you're going to experience, you might have been one of the top athletes in Australia, but that's different to one of the top athletes in Australasia, right? Or Asia, or the rest of the world internationally. So how does it impact a career of a young Australian gymnast, for sure, but Australian athlete, being so far away from the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think I look at it in two parts. One's the accessibility of it, because one, we don't have a lot of funding in Australia. So often we're self-funding trips or competitions to World Cups or, DTB or Pacific Rim Championships. It's coming out of our own pockets these days. World Championships is funded, the big continentals. Actually, in saying that, I still had to pay a bit for Oceania, even to New Zealand.
Wow.
So yeah, this is what I mean. Funding's being cut right back for gymnastics. So there's an accessibility issue. And I think what that does as well is it actually cuts back our talent and kind of makes it more about who can afford the sport than who's the best in the sport as well. Because if you're spending gym fees and then you have to spend $5,000-$10,000 per trip and you're only doing one comp per year, then that limits you as an athlete. So I think the accessibility of it is an entirely issue on itself, but then as well, the experience, and it's something you just can't replicate. I live in Belgium now and train here most of the time because actually, basically after World Championships last year, I was like, I'm going to come over here and train for a few months and see. And the progress I made in that short time by just being around athletes that are better than me was immeasurable, because in my program, we have some talented athletes, but objectively based on scores, I was the best athlete in my program. So I didn't really have people pushing me hard or someone I was chasing. So you get comfortable and you kind of, even if you don't mean to, you just don't work as hard, I find. So then by being around other athletes and having that firsthand experience, it drives you to another level. And then also competition experience is just something you can't do in a training gym. So even Bundesliga I've done, and Top 2 I'll do in a few weeks, and all these competitions, which is now having me compete 9 to 10 times more than people in Australia. So that's hugely a difference. And I think being so far away from Australia has limited us as a country in terms of competition experience and taking it to that next step. Because we have such talented guys and individually it works, but we can never really put it together. I think one, because of strategy, but also two, because of a lack of experience and access.
How typically is an Australian gymnast funding their career, Heath? Because, it's not like you're flying from Germany to France. A lot of the time you've got to fly from one side of the world to the other, which is incredibly expensive, right? So typically, how is an Australian athlete making that work? Is it through sponsors? Is it through family? Like, is it through having work outside of gymnastics? It sounds like it's very challenging just to get to the start line for some of the Australian athletes.
Yeah, it's becoming even more challenging. I think cost of living in general just makes everything harder. So then throw in an inaccessible, high cost sport on top of it is hard. But a lot of people rely on their families, and that, if you're a gymnast to your mid-20s, then it's not an issue. You can have them support you, but at least for myself, it wasn't something I wanted to do. I didn't want to feel reliant on my parents financially until this age.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough that I managed to tap into social media and then get sponsorships and brand deals from that. But even when you're funding your own sport and your travel, like the money doesn't go too far. But I'm fine at least that I can stay afloat and live and travel, and it's okay. And that's just because of social media and media. But otherwise, people are working. I know some guys work literally like 4:30 to 7:30 a.m. driving trucks and then go train and then come back and work during the day and then go train again. And then, people are studying on top of that because you don't want to box yourself into just gymnastics. So I remember one point I was at 19, I think I was working as a marketing officer, which was like 15, 20 hours a week. I was studying full time and I was training 30 hours a week. So you're looking at 70 hours and you kind of wonder, why is my gymnastics not progressing? And I think that's an identifiable point. So yeah, it's really difficult. And we have a lot of guys at the moment assessing if it's even feasible to continue for another few years, which is unfortunate, but I guess it's just the reality of the landscape of gymnastics in Australia.
Yeah, I think people will find that incredible. A country like Australia, where sport is such a big deal, it sounds very much like the sport is quite amateur still in the way that it's structured. It's incredible to learn that. I had no idea. You really surprised me with that, because I think typically over here in the UK, we just imagine, Australia, they'll have great systems in place, lots of funding, so incredible facilities. So that's really, really interesting. I don't feel like that was... I went to Australia in 2009. I did the Australian Youth Olympic Festival, which was an awesome competition. And I felt like at that time there was still maybe some structure and systems in place, and the facilities felt like they were incredibly good. So it's really interesting to hear that.
We're quite fortunate with facilities. We do have really great facilities, and I think that comes from government grants and funding, so that helps. But in-hand funding, even myself, it's not meant to complain, but you mentioned I was top gymnast in Australia last year, and I don't think I've ever received in-hand money for gymnastics in Australia. Like, I've never had funding per year. It's just, maybe your costs will be covered for this competition or camp, but it's never got money for the sport.
That's incredible. I'm so shocked with that. Did you make a conscious effort at one point, Heath, to try and take advantage of social media and your ability to communicate your story? Because in a way you were forced to, because that's the only way you can really finance your career, because that's really interesting. You're very good at it, and I spoke about that in our intro, and I think that's one reason why you have such a great following online. I think you're very authentic, and people will obviously identify with your story really well. But it sounds like you were almost forced to do that because in order to carry on being able to compete and potentially work towards your aspirations that you have within the sport. Yeah,
it's an active decision I had to make probably the start of 2023 and of 2022. I think I was only 21, 22. I was finishing up university. It was just kind of, it's fine for your parents to fund you up until that point. You just don't think that much about finances beyond if you're lucky enough to have that safety net. But then for me, I was like, oh, wow, this is a lot of money, and I don't want to rely on my parents anymore. And I don't want to continue the sport as well if I can only put 50 or 30% into it, because it's too much commitment for something I'm not going to reap any benefits from. So I had to really start digging into social media and knowing I had to expand my following base, and then sharing my story and reaching out to brands and so on. I think people often think, as an athlete, it's easy because you just film and you post. And for the most part, that can be true. But with the amount of platforms and everything these days, it takes me like hours and hours to really get across everything. And then also to, do PR and do events and talk to people and email and have meetings. It's quite a lot. But I'm fortunate enough now that I don't have to work outside of that. And I've finished my studies. So it is just social media and gymnastics, which I think is also contributing to myself progressing a lot quicker than previously. But it was something I had to push hard for, and no one else in Australia has managed to do that yet. So it was kind of an unknown for me, and just trial and error. But I think I'm fortunate enough that you say people resonate with my story and are happy to support and help.
Do you think if you're in that position, Heath, and it's very difficult when you're a young athlete, right? And you're still just trying to, the main focus is your gymnastics. But the reality is it's so saturated now, right? Like, I go online on social media and you go on gymnast profiles and there are so many athletes with massive followings online, right? So how do you stand out from that? Do you have to treat yourself almost like a business? Like, Heath Thorpe is the business, and I have to run Heath Thorpe like he is the business in order to do the thing that I want to do, which is gymnastics and express myself. Is that the way you approach it?
Yeah, now I do. I mean, my business is literally Heath Thorpe. That's the name of it. So technically, yeah. And I have team management and I have editors now that I've started onboarding. So it has had to kind of become a business. But you do have to separate, because there's a point where it becomes a bit blurry when it goes from your personal social media to then a professional social media. And whilst I remain as authentic and personable as I can to my bigger audiences, you also then have to learn what boundaries to put in place and also what you want to put out, because once you get a certain level of influence, things are taken a lot more seriously and they're also focused on a lot more. So you have to be more deliberate in everything you put out to the world. So I think that's when you have to switch to the business mindset, which is a bit weird to do because it's just yourself. But it's how social media works now. And as you said, it's so saturated. And the thing is as well, like, no one cares if you can do a triple twist or a quad twist. The normal person doesn't, because they don't know what it is. So it's what can you do to capture the general audience's attention within seconds for them to then follow you and want to lean into your story. And that's a whole different ball game than just posting a gymnastic skill.
I think that's really good advice, mate. And I even find myself doing the same thing, right? Because I don't often share photos anymore, many photos of like my son or my family, right? It's purely for like work and the business, and it has to be professional. You're right, there has to be that professional layer. So I think that's really helpful advice for people that are maybe in that period of being stuck between maybe not having a lot of influence, but it's building and they're on that come up and they're on their way and they're trying to kind of find their way within the sport in order to financially support themselves in their career. So I think that's brilliant, mate. Just tell me a little bit about when you first competed on the international stage at the highest level, so World Championships in 2018. What were the big takeaways from that competition? When you left, you went back to Australia. What were you left with in terms of, okay, wow, I really need to work on this, or I'm really far away from competing there at that level. These are the things that I really need to focus on moving forward, because I think everybody has that. I remember going to the World Championships in 2010 when I was 17, and I just used to go and watch the Japanese train, and I just go around the training gyms watching everybody and thinking, right, there's a lot that I need to improve on right here if I want to be competing at the very highest level.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I don't actually know, when I try and reflect on it, I don't know what I took away from that. I feel like I was almost too young to understand. And I think when I looked at that level, it almost felt inaccessible. Like everyone was just too good. So it's almost like you don't even dare to chase those skills of that gymnastics. And now I reflect on it 6 years later, like for high bar, I'm doing those skills, which is great. But I didn't make a conscious decision after that moment to do that. I think it was just kind of, you saw this gymnastics, you wanted to replicate it here and there. But also at that age, I think I lacked the specific drive and plan. So it was more just, I'm doing the sport, I'm doing skills, I'm doing this because I've always done it. And you just go into the gym. So I was motivated, but it was also, I think, again, that bubbled motivation of being the best in Australia, because that was what was achievable. I didn't ever see myself being a world champion. So I was like, I'll be Australian champion. And then you work to that, but then that's capped at a certain level. So I think for me, it was because actually 2018, I was a reserve as well. So I didn't get to compete. So for me, it was, I'm going to make the team and then I get to compete. And for a few years, that was great. And it was only up until last year or 2 years ago where I decided like, oh, I don't want to just go compete at a competition anymore. I got to do that in 2022 World Championships, and I was injured leading up to it, but I was just happy to kind of be there. And it was a great experience and so on. But then I was like, oh, what now if I'm just going to tick off these competitions? And it's also no shade to anyone that does that. I understand why people do sport differently. But for myself, it was, I want to now be one of the best. So what does that take? And that was a part of moving here and doing all these other things. So yeah, to answer your question, back in 2018, I don't know how much it changed. Then I think maybe subconsciously later on it helped. But I think I just needed to mature a bit and understand while I was doing the sport before I could implement what I learned.
Well, you achieved that goal, Heath, and you became the Australian all-around champion 2023. Tell me about that experience and then missing out on the World Championships that were in Belgium at the end of that year.
Yeah, oof, that was a fun experience. That was interesting. I kind of had all around's not really my thing. I do it because we lack all arounders in Australia, and it was your easiest pathway onto a team in a sense. If you could be the top 1 to 3 all arounders, you're the base of the team. So for me, it was like, okay, let's do that, and then also knowing it was going to be my simplest path to Olympic qualification. So they were kind of the reasons I did that all around the last few years. And I was steadily improving. And I know Pommel always lagged behind, so it would always cut me off. But last year I managed to get a routine that would hold in the all around. And yeah, I finally won an Australian Championships last year. And I also was one of the top scorers on multiple events with floor, vault, high bar being my strengths, and even rings I think I placed on. And so it was well rounded. And I felt after that, okay, perfect. I can just focus to World Championships now, which is going to be qualifying as an individual. Or at the time I thought we were going to push for a team, but then that later changed, and then that was a part of the non-selection. So to be fair, it wasn't necessarily a shock. I know it came as a lot of shock to people externally, but I had a bit of a feeling it was going to happen just with conversations that would go on internally. You know how political sport is. So I remember I actually had a legal team ready before the selection was announced.
Wow.
That's kind of how confident I was it was going to happen. And then once it happened, then I took it to the National Sports Tribunal, and that was a whole experience itself. That costed money. That costed almost 20K Australian, wow. Which is I don't know, 10, 12,000 pounds. That was out of pocket as well. And even then, once I was partially successful in the case, they didn't have to take it on. So then they just did the same team again. And then it was also an ostracizing experience, because on one hand, it's super awkward as well. One, the athletes are never at fault for those decisions, but then naturally, especially given my platform and the reach, it kind of was going to happen that it was me versus them.
Yeah.
And I hated how much of a spotlight it put on them negatively as well. So that created a cultural issue as well, obviously within a team, and awkwardness, and then coaches. And yeah, it had a lot of long-term effects that just weren't enjoyable. So I'm glad I stuck to my morals and I did it. And I don't know if I'd do it again, but I'm glad I did it in terms of standing up for myself and integrity. But yeah, it definitely wasn't an experience I'd wish on anyone. And it's frustrating that you can be the best in the country at the time and not make a 5-person team. But sport will be sport, I guess.
You're very brave for doing that, mate, and going through with that, because I remember in 2016 when I was in a very similar situation, and I was advised to take it to High Court, and it was going to be £40,000, and if I won, British Gymnastics would pay. If I lost, that comes out of my pocket, which is just a staggering amount of money, right? And at that time, I look back now, and look, I made the best decision that I did for me at that time, but I was certainly very much, I think, I was certainly ostracized. There was a lot of fear. I was very aware that I wanted to carry on for 4 more years, and how is this going to be held against me? And actually, I look back now and I wish that if I was an older man, I would have taken it all the way just purely out of morals and principles and values. But at the time, I was 23, but for me, that's still very young. And I wasn't a very mature 23-year-old. And I think I was basically just scared and bullied into keeping quiet a little bit. So for you to have done that at your age is, incredibly brave, mate. So well done for doing that. And I'm sure you learned a lot about yourself. I look back at that period of my life, and I actually think a lot of the morals, principles, and I guess the pillars of my character were decided in that experience. I kind of felt, right, now, gymnastics is important, but there are other things in life that are way more important, and I'm going to take this experience and use this as the framework for how I move forward. So, I hope you feel the same about that experience now. And did that influence, Heath, your decision then to look at moving to Belgium and train there? And why did you pick Belgium?
Firstly, I think the same point. It's only been a year later, but I think in my young adulthood, it was probably the most pivotal point in my personal development beyond the gymnastics, because I just learned a lot about self-integrity and morals and principles and so on. And I also it also happened the year before, 2022 Commonwealth Games.
Okay.
think I finished fifth in the all-round, but that was the 4-mark neutral deduction on pommel because I accidentally had a short routine. Anyway, long story short, the next day I medaled in most event finals, and then we had Oceania Championships the week after, and I finished, third all-around, highest scoring team, all this and this, and then I was still left off, and I brought it internally as an appeal, which you do before it goes beyond. Okay. And they had answers, but it wasn't the best answers. But I think similar to you, I was like, I still need to make it to Paris, so I need to keep going. So I'm not going to do this. But by the time I got to the year after, I was kind of fed up with it. So I decided to do that. But yeah, it was an experience for sure. But then I guess to answer the question about Belgium, I trained over here a few times throughout when I was coming over for Bundesliga. I did that in 2021 and then 2022. Often when you travel to Europe as well as an Australian gymnast, you stay back to train or you go early to train just because you're already over there or spending that money and it's such a long way. So I just often found myself in Belgium, specifically Ghent at the national program here. And I just really appreciated their holistic approach to gymnastics. It was very autonomous. It was very up to the athlete. They did a big reshuffle of the men's side after not qualifying anyone to Tokyo. And I think they were very deliberate in how they approached that program. So I always appreciated that. And then I kind of just needed to get away. As you said, it was ostracizing, that experience. And I didn't really want to be in a national team camp setting. I didn't want to be around it. I was just so fed up and frustrated. I was like, I'm just going to go away. I'm going to go to Bundesliga. And then I was like, I'll train here. So I rang the national head coach and we have a really good working relationship and he's great. And he was like, yep, come over, come train with us. If you want to lead into Paris here, then we'll do that. So I did that for 6 months. And as I said, developmentally, I improved a lot. But then I just kind of refound a bit of a love for the sport in terms of approaching training and the routine of it and being able to put aside the politics and just isolate myself and focus on the craft was a really enjoyable experience. So after I took some time off after not making Paris, I decided I wanted to base myself here moving forward if possible. And that's what we're working towards now.
When you look back at that 4-year cycle, Heath, and it wasn't really 4 years, was it? It was 3 years in the lead up to Paris. Are you able to look back and rationally think, okay, what were some of the strategical decisions that I made that were potentially mistakes and that maybe you wouldn't make again? Do you feel like there were any? Do you feel like it was purely politics, or do you think, right, maybe I could have done this here and that would have put me in a stronger position to make sure that I was almost undeniable. I had to be in the team. Does that make sense, that question? Because I think there are certain, even things for me, I look back on that experience in 2016 and I think there were things that I could have done slightly differently that would have certainly put me in a position that would have made it, would have given me a stronger case to have to been on that team. Not necessarily that that's the way that you should do it. It should purely just be on numbers, right? but that's not how it works in sport. And I think other athletes were maybe a little bit more savvy than I was and quite smart in what they were doing in their decision making and were maybe able to take the emotion out of the sport a little bit. I'm quite an emotional guy and I just wasn't able to do that. It was just passion for me always.
Yeah. I mean, hindsight's a great thing, right? And we can reflect and have different opinions. I think I potentially would have specialized last quad if I knew it was going to be a lot of chop and change with team strategies. Even Commonwealth Games, originally it was like, let's go for a team medal. So I was like, okay, I make myself as well-rounded as a gymnast. And they ended up only putting 3 up on half the events at the Commonwealth Games and then missing out on a team medal. So that wasn't relevant to the team goal. But then it was after that, it's like, no, let's push 2022 Worlds. We'll go for a team. And then 2023, so I kind of just kept falling into the trap of being like, all right, I'm going to be a team gymnast for the team. Yeah. And I think I wish I kind of just ripped the Band-Aid off and was like, I'm just going to maximize my specializing on high bar and floor and try and go the individual route that way. I still don't think it would have been enough because one, the code didn't favor me as much as the next one is about to, and 2, individual apparatus quotas to Olympics was so competitive. Yeah. I don't think the outcome would have been differently, but maybe I would have felt like I had a bit more power over that rather than just leaving it in the hands of selectors and the federation. So I think I would have specialized a lot earlier, and I think I would have also established a bit more of a confidence of better results because as I said, I'm not the best all-around gymnast, so I was just doing it for the sake of Australia. But I think maybe if I focused on my better events, I could have climbed internationally a bit more and put myself in a better position. So maybe specializing back in 2022.
it's very difficult, isn't it, when you're stuck between two minds of, right,
Yeah.
I'm trying to push to be an all-rounder, but I've got these strengths over here that are significantly stronger than my weaknesses. What do I do? And it's almost like being half pregnant, right? You can't be half pregnant. You're either in or you're not in. Is
True.
that the approach going into the next cycle, Heath? Are you thinking, right, I'm going to look at potentially specialising? Is that not the case? How are you now reflecting on that experience? You just spoke about potentially I would have specialised earlier. How are you approaching this new cycle? You've spoke about the rules certainly lending themselves to your style of gymnastics, especially on high bar. I mean, I'm looking at high bar, I'm looking at Defs and Jaegers, they're all being upgraded, right? Even Gingers. And then I'm looking at, even on floor, Arabians being upgraded again, which is great. I used to love doing double pike Arabians. So those skills are just beautiful to watch. How are you approaching this new code of points? And in terms of the strategy again, if you are, I know you said right now, look, I'm not making the Olympics the be all and end all, but I'm sure you've got aspirations to be there. And if you're in a position to compete for it, you're going to want to do that. How are you strategically approaching this cycle that's about to come?
Yeah, I think the support team here, and my personal coach in Australia had the same belief, but as a broader team, I think they have a belief and a vision that I can be one of the best high bar workers in the world. And when people would tell me that years ago, I would just laugh it off. And again, I think it's just by being in Australia in a bubble, you don't believe those things. But this team's really instilled a lot of self-belief into me. And we've worked really hard. So the opportunity lays in high bar. It's basically like when we look at the skill sets, the upgrades, I could, with endurance pending, put up a 6'2", 8 skill new code. Wow. And we're like, there's probably 10 gymnasts in the world that could do that right now. So automatically you're placing yourself in a top cohort of potential athletes. So I think before the quad even starts, I'm seeing it in that way rather than just build and see where I go. So the opportunity lies there, and that's what I'm specializing on. And I'll do floor because, as you said, there's upgrades that suit my style as well. And then I'll keep vault for team purposes and, make myself kind of rounded enough to be a team athlete, but at the same time, be good enough on a high bar that I go as an individual regardless. So yeah, as I'm taking kind of a year at a time, my goal is the World Cups and I want finals. I want to push a medal first, and then, World Championships, I'd love to make a final. And I think then sit back, reassess and kind of see where I'm at. But if I don't feel like I'm competitive for finals or medals at majors, I probably won't continue pushing in the sport because of how hard it is accessibility-wise financially. So for me, it's kind of 12 months at a time, with high bar being the big end goal. And then if that leads to an LA qualification, perfect.
So it's very purposeful, the approach this time. And you do have pedigree in Australia, right? Philip Rizzo, 2006, high bar world champion. So it's there. And I'm very excited to see. I've watched this routine that you're building develop over time. And I know I've messaged you about your triple back. And I was like, please do it with your legs together. It will look so nice. Like, do it. It will set you apart. Because I know that lots of people are going to start doing triple backs. And I think for me personally, my opinion is that the drop to 8 skills is going to bring everybody closer. So it's how can you stand out? Because what typically happens in gymnastics, right, is by the end of the Olympic cycle, those 8 routines you get in an Olympic final, everybody's found the path of least resistance to get themselves closest to get into that medal. And so the routines look very similar, but you have such a unique style. I think that that's going to help you stand out. In terms of the actual skills that you were working on at the moment, are you just trying to put that all together now? Because it feels to me like you've got this real body of work, and it's about how do I put this together, piece it together in the right way, and also be able to compete that routine consistently at the highest level. How many high-level finals have you been in on high bar? And what have you noticed about the best high bar workers, Heath? Because it's a very different animal competing on high bar. It's very different to other apparatus. I experienced competing in quite a lot of finals, particularly European finals, with some of the very best. And it's such an interesting piece of apparatus, I think it really comes down to mindset a lot of the time. You can be in the warm-up gym and missing everything, but if you go in and you think, I'm catching this bar no matter what, it's such an interesting final. I've been in finals where everybody's fell, where everybody's hit. Just tell me a little bit about the strategy of building the routine that you are at the moment and what you've noticed about top-level high bar workers and where you feel like maybe I need to improve to get up to that level.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as I said, I kind of just focused on all-around and team the last quad. So I did a few challenge cups, but I didn't go to any World Cups, and I went to 1 World Championships and no Commonwealth Games. So there was limited opportunity to push high bar anyway. I did a few challenge cup finals, and I guess that was an experience in a high bar final itself. But I actually struggled a lot with mental blocks on high bar the last few years, and that prevented me from as well reaching a potential there. Like I was too scared to do a Jaeger full or a def. I definitely was not going to get myself to do a triple back. And the last few months or year, I guess I've kind of gotten over that with the help of the team here, including psychologists. So now I'm excited to step into that new confidence. But I think for me, it's about building in measurable steps. So one, I'm fortunate enough how the skills are valued that every single one of my releases gets upgraded and then I get a dismount bonus. So I don't have to change or learn a single skill to get one of the highest star values probably going around. So that's a blessing. So now it's already just about refinement, which is already becoming a little bit monotonous day to day. I'm like, okay, how many defs and gingas can I do? And sometimes I just play instead. I'll just do whatever I want and just have some fun. But we're starting with like a 5-6, and that's without the Jaeger Ginga, and that's just a stoop half into Ginga and then Jaeger full triple back. And then the next step is to add the stoop half def, which adds 0.5 or whatever it is. And the routine construction stays the same, but you're just adding one full twist. And then the last step is adding the Jaeger Ginga connection, stoop half def, Jaeger full triple back. So there's a very clear streamline of how to do the routine from now to 2028, I guess. That we're focusing on. And a lot for that for me is mental. I think it's one of the biggest mental apparatus. It's very challenging, but I have a new way of thinking about it, and it's come from one of the coaches here. But he sees my high bar as kind of like a violin. That's how he describes it. And he says, I need to be in tune with fluidity and movement and focus in on that. So a lot of what I do in training is, I don't know, it's almost like a weird connection with the bar, and I try and make it feel like an art, but I have this like fluidity to the work and this movement where I feel connected to it and I'm not working against it. It's not, when you watch my routine, it's a lot of Kovacs, a lot of up and down, everything stays circular. So it's about tempo, not rushing, not getting ahead of myself, and just remembering a lot of mental cues is helping a lot lately.
Yeah, I think the high bar for me, when I still try, in actually the last few weeks, I've been getting back on the high bar and I've absolutely loved it, man, because it's like the best feeling in the world. For me, I think high bar was like just pure escapism, because the way I swing bar is with my head tucked in and my ears into my shoulders. So as soon as I'm swinging around the bar, I don't hear anything. It all disappears. It's just me and the bar. And for me, it's just beautiful. And I've been, back on the high bar the last few weeks, and I think the high bar for me has always been about feel. It's feel, like feeling the swing and the hang, and I want it to be almost like a hot knife through butter, just smooth. I was always, when I caught a Kovac that felt like that, it was like I couldn't feel myself catching the bar. It was just, it was like, it was art. For me, gymnastics is art, right? It's expression. So it's going to be really exciting to see you build that routine. Just talk a little bit about how difficult it has been to try and put that triple back in when it comes to endurance, right? Because especially if you're trying to do it with your legs together, for me, when I was starting to do that at the end of routines, it was so hard to grab my legs, like just to have like almost the stomach strength at the end of a routine when I was tired to get the top of my knees so I could pull them in and hold them in. How tough has that been? I've seen that you competed in the Bundesliga and done the triple back. Is that going to be a big challenge in terms of getting all of that difficulty in and having the endurance to do a triple back and being able to try and stick it, right?
Yeah, it's it's a big one to conquer. I only really started doing triple backs again end of last year, and once again it was only because of the coaches here that were like, you should be doing a triple back, and I was like, no, it's such a big skill, it's too scary, I would never do that. And after some convincing, I obviously am now doing it. But yeah, I can hop up and land 6 to 8 triple backs a day, no problem, singular. And then as soon as you do a half routine or a full routine, you're winding up for the dismount. And I'm just thinking about not dying. Like, honestly, when I was competed the first time at Australian Championships, I was just like holding onto the bar and like, please just don't die, don't die, don't die. And it sounds so dramatic, but with such a big skill, it's just, it's such a build up. So to then do it with good execution is another thing. And it's one thing I'm still trying to work on, but I have a very perfectionist mindset. So even if I do a triple back at the end of the routine, if my legs are apart, like, I'm so frustrated with myself. And I think that's what's going to eventually set me apart, but I have to move through that process to get to the end point. And as I said, it's something where we're building, and my coaches are reminding me here to trust in, but it's like a whole nother skill. It doesn't even feel like the same skill when you're doing it at the end of the routine compared to singular.
I think it'd be interesting for you maybe to like go back and watch Rhys McClenaghan's build up towards that routine he did in Paris, because, you know, I personally feel like you could only do that maybe once in your career, and you only need to do it once, right? Like maybe if you get that opportunity, it could be a final at a World Cup or a final at a World Championships or an Olympic Games, right? But to master a routine, and that's what I feel like you're trying to do. Like that routine, I feel personally like I'm following the journey of that routine. And to master it, you only maybe need to do that once, and maybe following what Rhys did, because he pulled it off, right, at the biggest moment of all, and it was probably the best he could ever do that routine. It was, I think, the most perfect pole and horse routine I'd ever seen. It was incredible. And that's what I feel like you're doing, because that routine for me that Rhys did was like artwork, and I feel that's what your high bar is and what it can be. So it's going to be really interesting to follow that journey for me moving forward, mate. What are your plans for the rest of the year and your hopes moving forward as you go into 2025?
End of this year, it's kind of just more, refining what I'm already doing. And I go back to Australia in a few weeks just for the holidays and to enjoy myself and keep training. But eyes are set on World Cups early next year. So pending selection, that's the first goal. And I want to see where I stand amongst the field in the new code of points. It's all great to be able to talk hypotheticals, but I need to actually see it in practice. So that's what the aim of those ones are. Maybe try the depth there, but start with the 5-6 of the first one and then build from there if there's room for it. And then I want to aim for World Championships at the end of next year. But honestly, it's just kind of taking it day by day, week by week, which I know a lot of people say, but I think it's the only way to make it manageable. So for me, it's just, it's going into the gym and swinging pipe, and that's kind of it.
What advice would you give, Heath, for somebody that's maybe thinking about trying deaf but is petrified of the idea of that skill? For some reason, when I was a kid, I always had really good visualization, and I could always close my eyes and visualize myself doing a deaf, right? But the idea of getting up on a bar, gianting, and then from handstand doing a deaf just frightens the life out of me. But I would love to try and do that skill, because it's just technically, it's such an amazing skill. What would be the most important piece of advice you would give someone?
Mentally, I find it easier from a stoop half. Because I have less time to think. So I'm just focused on stacking stoop half to handstand, and then I drop into the tap and I go, if you have to, I probably can't get myself to go giant death because I'll chicken out and I think too much. So I actually learn it from hop half into a death.
Oh, wow.
Actually, no, I learned Markelov into death. So I've always done it from a connection. So that's one thing. I think mentally, if you have less time to think about the skill, it can be better, but everyone's different. But I think a textbook ginger is crucial for a good deaf, and I don't mean like just being able to pull into the bar. It's about a rounded chest and rotating up and over and sitting and seeing the bar. We literally just went back to stoop half ginger last week because I lost deaf for 1 week for whatever reason. I couldn't catch, and since then it's been 100% hit rate in a week. So you need to still have those steps. And even if some people need to do a full twist, spot, half, just go through it and find a way. Do it over a pit. You're probably going to hit the bar a few times. You're probably going to land on your head in the pit a few times. But take your time with it and don't skip over a ginger just because you want a deaf, because it's not going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you do it, it's aggressive the way you do a ginger and a jaeger. It's very, I think because guys don't typically do those skills, sometimes they can be a bit reserved, right? Like it's like you're hitting the bar rather than really putting yourself in the right position to catch. I think your ginger looks somewhat like Lucan's, right? Nastier Lucan's when she used to do on A-bars. That's what it kind of reminds me of. I'm sure it was an inspiration, right?
Yeah, I watched her ginger to learn it.
Oh, amazing. So I'll focus on that first. I'll start with ginger and not get ahead of myself. But Heath, thank you so much, mate. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been great to learn a little bit about your story. Where can people find you online? I know you've got a big following already, but if people want to learn a little bit more about your story and maybe follow you over the next few years, where can they find you, mate?
Yeah, I mean, Instagram's the easiest platform and it will link you to everything. I am starting up a YouTube channel again. And again, you're actually in the mood board for the editors for your old vlogs. So,
no way. Oh, wow. Oh, thank you, man. That's brilliant.
So people, I guess you can probably see a little bit more in depth on there coming up over the next few months and years. But yeah, Instagram, you'll kind of find everything.
Amazing. Heath, thank you very much, mate, and all the best. And make sure you have a nice Christmas. And keep doing what you're doing, mate, because I really enjoy it.
Pleasure, mate. Thanks for having me.